right. Welcome to this live streamed event from the Martinus Centre Klint and from Stockholm, connected through Jonas Dalmose in Denmark. My name is Pernilla Rosell. I'm sitting in Stockholm. I'm Swedish, but we are doing this together with Martinus Centre Klint in Denmark, thanks to technology, God willing, technology permitting, we could say. It is a talk based on Martinus cosmology, the Danish writer Martinus, and we want to present some reflections and thoughts on the present world situation today, and perhaps on our personal situation as well, since we know that it has changed dramatically the last few weeks due to the coronavirus pandemic. So I will not give an introduction to Martinus's works. I think that many of you who might be listening right now in Scandinavia and outside Scandinavia, and perhaps later on the United States or anywhere else, know Martinus already. If you don't, if you have no idea who this writer is, I would recommend you to have a look at the Martinus Institute's website, martinus.dk, where you will find films, works and so on, where you could get some more information about him. But today I'm just going to give a brief talk, perhaps 30-40 minutes, and present some key points, some reflections on the world situation and our personal situation, what it's like today, not because we have any definite answers, because we haven't, but we who are interested in this particular work, the cosmic analysis by Martinus, we think that it's very rewarding to share those reflections with you right now. And that's why we want to do these live streaming events. This is the first one in English. We've done some in Danish before. And we are very happy to be connected with you in this way. I think that many of you, like myself, suddenly find yourselves isolated at home. You don't know what happened. But here we are, and we can connect through the internet. At least we hope so. So, as I said, I will give a brief talk and then we will have a break. And after the break, I hope that I can be connected to my dear friend Mary McGovern in Copenhagen. So it's quite advanced what we're trying to do here, thanks to our technician. But before we do that, I have, as you can see here, some key points, some bullet points, as we could say. The first one would be adapting to a new reality. Perhaps it's not a new reality to all of you. Some things look very familiar, but a colleague of mine, I work at the university in Stockholm, she just told me, okay, I'm fine, but what happened? I mean, what just happened? How could this happen? Why are we closed? Why is everybody at home? I mean, we do understand it, but I don't think that we really get it. And we don't know how long it's going to last. And I think that's the same with many of you as well. Borders have been closed, schools have been closed, universities have been closed, and so on. So just reflect a little on that would be the first thing. Then, what is the coronavirus and why has it struck us? That is, of course, a big question, and I don't pretend at all that I can answer it, but I have received some help from a dear friend of mine and a Martinus teacher colleague, Rune Östensson, who kindly offered to give me some help on that. So I talked to him and he gave me some ideas about how we could interpret this situation. Why do we have to experience this? What is this virus and where does it come from? So I will try to share this with you and lean on his knowledge. Any mistakes are due to my limited knowledge. Then, of course, briefly go into one of the many basic principles of Martinus. He has written lots and lots of cosmic analysis based on fundamental principles, and one of them being the principle of cause and effect, which of course we know from everyday life. In the material world, Martinus tells us that it also applies to our mental world, to our spiritual world. All the thoughts, all the actions that we produce will have an effect, and we'll talk more about that later on, or I will share that with you. Then, as you can see, we know, I already said that this has affected me, it has affected friends and colleagues. And what happens when we find a world struck by fear? Because I think that's one way to describe it. And this line, "when your thinking gets kidnapped by fear," is a quote. It's not from Martinus himself. It's from a Swedish book on cosmic psychology. I will get back to that later on. I think it summarizes very well what we can see right now. I think our thinking, our thoughts seem to be kidnapped by fear. It could happen individually many times, but right now we seem to have a collective wave, I think, of fearful thoughts. And of course, the title of this lecture is "To Find Hope and Meaning in Challenging Times," I wrote, and here it's even "in the darkness." So I will end by trying to find some advice, perhaps, or just thoughts, ideas that we could use in order to find support in Martinus's analysis, to find hope, to find meaning in difficult times. Right, these are my so-called bullet points, and just start with the first one, a new reality. In a way, I think we know this, so it might not be that valid just to repeat it, and we get this news every day, every hour, in a way that might not be so healthy for us. But I just saw some numbers today. They are probably not even correct any longer. About 3,400,000 confirmed cases of infected people, human beings on Earth, 400,000 deaths, and a lot of people then again being recovered. It just says something about the impact, and that we also have a very global sensitivity. We count this every day. We don't do that with people with people dying from starvation, for example, but we are very, very keen on knowing exactly where are we with the coronavirus. And of course, one reason is that we are so connected. We are so sensitive. We have been traveling a lot. At the moment, we can't. But we have been traveling a lot, which means that we are also afraid of this virus being spread without control, in a way, you could say. And of course, we can see that in Sweden, in the US, in Europe, in many countries, in Denmark, I just heard. Global stock markets have fallen. We are steering towards a large global recession. And that, of course, has huge impacts. And probably people who have lost their jobs or will lose their jobs or risk losing their jobs. And I live in Scandinavia. I consider myself to be extremely well situated in the respect that we live in a state, a welfare state, but not all people are that lucky. We can just see that this crisis will have an impact that might last a lot longer than the actual virus will last. National borders have closed. That was one of the first signs that I saw myself. The border to Denmark was closed. We don't even need a passport in order to go to Denmark when I was a child. So it was very dramatic, and one of the first things that really made me sort of actually feel some kind of fear. What is happening? The borders to Germany is closed, in Europe, and so on. And we see that 64 global airlines, I read today, have completely stopped flying. So that's a very concrete change as well. Many people are working from home. We have restricted freedom in the sense that we shouldn't travel. Our own Prime Minister in Sweden has advocated against traveling the whole summer, not abroad, not even within Sweden. Some people think, by the way, that Sweden hasn't got any restrictions, which I think is a false image, because we do. Perhaps we trust a little more on sort of voluntary restrictions, but we do have a lot of restrictions in Sweden as well. And as I said, when it comes to traveling, many people don't do that. We don't visit old parents and so on. So things have happened. It is a different reality. We can't meet physically the way we would like to do. We used to do. And one thing that I find very interesting, being a teacher myself by profession, more than 1.5 billion pupils and students, I hope I get it right, are now receiving online teaching. almost overnight. Actually, we would call it, I think, emergency remote teaching, perhaps rather than e-learning, because we just got 1 or 2 days in order to create some kind of emergency teaching. So it's not the best kind of online teaching, but we learn a lot. And the fact that we see this development from a global perspective, all those children, all those students going through the same development, it's certainly very interesting from a spiritual point of view. What happens right now? What is happening? What effects will this have? So those are some of the facts, some of the things we can observe. And of course, we have so many other things. We have museums in Sweden closing down or risk closing down. Suddenly, people losing their jobs. We have conferences, concerts, festivals, events of different kinds, sport events, usually very, very important things that we gather around, perhaps not personally, but I know many people who do, my sons, for example, and they're just being cancelled. So the things that we look forward to in the summer to stick around, to enjoy these things together, that will be different. Many religious festivities have been cancelled. We noticed that in Easter. We have Ramadan being cancelled, or at least being cancelled in the usual way. We have no services in Stockholm. We have online services, so again, we move online. That has an impact as well. In the beginning especially, we noticed, I think, that some supplies just weren't able to be found any longer, like toilet paper. I think that has sort of changed now, but we could see that people panicked in a way and just prepared for a long period of crisis, or perhaps for worse things to come. We don't know. And that, of course, having Martinus's worldview as a basis and knowing that he states that we have many, many, many lives behind us. Of course, we realize as those events trigger some kinds of trigger a behavior that because we need to be prepared. But I'll come back to that. We have rising bankruptcies and unemployment. Lots and lots of bankruptcies. I heard that confirmed this morning as well. When it comes to Denmark, that it's really going very, very fast and we don't know where it's going to end. So, of course, that creates a lot of uncertainty. And for many people, perhaps personal disappointments and perhaps even disasters. We have social isolation and some negative effects. I'm not going to talk so much about the negative effects, but we know there has been an increase in abuse against women. Also children. We know that more alcohol is being bought, more people are gaming, also watching Netflix and things. That is perhaps not so bad, but I also read recently that people are counting on an increase in divorces and also in an increase in pregnancies, and that tells us something about what we do, what human behavior is like, if we are bored or isolated. And of course, some positive effects as well. Some people, like myself personally, enjoy not having to travel so much to work, and we have more time for reflection, walking in nature and so on. So it isn't always negative, but it certainly has some measurable negative effects. Digital activities are increasing massively. We see that as well, different kinds. Could be schooling, could be working. I tried to just buy a gadget for this live stream event. I had to visit 3 different stores because everything was sold out. Headsets and different kinds of adapters. No, sold out. We just see that those shops are really doing very, very well at the moment. Well, that's just so far, and I think that my own working place closed down on the 17th of March, which would be almost exactly 1.5 months. So it has been 6 weeks. And we are being closed until September, at least. Closed meaning no students are allowed on our physical campus. So the interesting thing will be, what will the impact be like in summer or after the summer? I can't say I can predict it, but I think it's interesting to reflect on it. Right, moving on to my point 2 then, what is a virus? Which is perhaps a more difficult thing for me to talk about since my background is in the humanities. So I will just briefly go through the biological facts and then move on to the more spiritual perspective, which I think is the most interesting perspective for you. But you could read, it's very useful, but you can get knowledge when you don't know anything. You could read in the English Wikipedia, a virus is a submicroscopic infectious agent that replicates only inside the living cells of an organism. There are millions of types of viruses in our environment. Viruses are found in almost every ecosystem on Earth and are the most numerous type of biological entity, which I find interesting. You can see nature here in the picture, which is actually Klint in Denmark, not far from where our technician Jonas is sitting right now. So imagine we have lots and lots of viruses which you can't see because they are very, very, very small, a lot smaller than bacteria, for example. And in this case, we have a virus that has turned to be harmful to us. And I think that most of you know then that people, at least traditional science, is counting on, even if researchers don't agree completely, but counting on the origin being in an animal market in China, where a dangerous virus was transmitted from animals, probably bats, at least that's one of the most general theories. So we do have viruses everywhere, but sometimes they turn out to be dangerous to us, as in this case, more dangerous than others. Some people get it badly, some people hardly notice them, and you could ask yourself, why is that? And that is where I wanted to go on to the world picture that we are talking about, the eternal world picture, written down by Martinus. And here you see his symbol, number 11, the eternal world picture, the living being 2, the eternal Godhead, and the eternal sons of God. And what I wanted to ask my friend Rune then is exactly, okay, we know then a virus is something that you can investigate from a material point of view, but what is it really? Because something that scientists tell us when you listen to experts on television, a virus doesn't really live. It's sort of on the edge of being alive, a being between almost alive but more mineral. At least that's what I get. And then I ask then, what is it really from our point of view? Because Martinus tells us everything is alive. So a virus has to be something as well. And he confirmed that, obviously. And if we have a look on the symbol, which is sometimes also called the main symbols, we know that Martinus tells us that our existence, and then he means the existence of all living beings, not just human beings. He means animals, plants, minerals, and spiritual beings that have no physical bodies are going through. And let's see if I can use my mouse. I think I can. Yes, Jonas confirms that. We can see that we have a spiral cycle. Beginning here, we could say slowly in the mineral kingdom, when we actually have mineral material. We know that, we can observe it, but we don't experience this as alive. But Martinus tells us, yes, it is connected to living beings with consciousness, but their day consciousness is on a spiritual plane, so they don't experience any pain or anything really on the physical plane. And then we move on to this red area, the plant kingdom, where beings they're still based on instinct. They still don't feel pain or anything in the physical world, but they start feeling something. They're just sensing something in the outer world, sort of beginning their existence into what Martinus would call a spiral cycle. And then we have the orange part here, which is actually the animal kingdom, where you see the earth in the middle. And this is the transition phase where we are placed. He calls us terrestrial human beings, half animals, half real human beings. The real human kingdom being the yellow part. And then we go on here up to the higher spiritual parts of the spiral cycle. But the interesting thing here, I just invite you to read more about his fantastic symbols on our homepage, martinus.dk. The interesting thing is that Rune actually placed a virus somewhere here. So actually on the perhaps edge of being alive. Of course it is alive, but it is just starting its journey into the plant kingdom. somewhere between the mineral kingdom and the plant kingdom, but somewhat closer to the plant kingdom, because it does contain information, a virus, but it can't reproduce unless it gets into a macro being, you could say, a cell. And when it does, it could reproduce massively, massively, massively. And of course, that's not good for our organisms. So yes, I mean, they are viruses driven by instinct. It's quite automatic. You could imagine that as a pre-stadium, if I understand it correctly, to plants, because of course plants also want to reproduce massively. You know that if you have a garden. So somewhere here you have the virus, lots and lots, millions of viruses, and somehow sometimes they turn out to be harmful to us, as in the case of the coronavirus. And that's perhaps the more interesting questions. When do bacteria and viruses get harmful to us? He also called them seeds containing information. So they could be dormant, you could say, asleep for a long while. And then suddenly, with the right conditions, they could just sort of start to reproduce themselves, almost perhaps, I think, like an alien in an alien film, but you just sort of find some kind of life that tends to automatically just explode, and you can't get rid of it. So, well, here we are, and here it would be somewhere virus beings. So they are beings like us, but in a completely different stage in the spiral cycle. And of course, that's a completely different perspective, not contradictory to physical science, I think, but it adds so many other dimensions. And why then has the coronavirus struck us? And if we just start with, again, the non-spiritual science, but very humane, humanitarian thinking, I'm sure that many of you know these scientists or these researchers, Dr. Greger, physician, and Harari, a historian from Israel. And those are just two examples of many people who have pointed to what we would think is probably the most important connection between the coronavirus and our behavior, and that is how we behave and treat animals and meat eating. And I'm sure we'll come back to that, Mary and I, later on. Dr. Greger has written about food and the importance of food and the importance of treating animals well, but he also, which is very interesting, predicted the likelihood of a pandemic almost identical to the coronavirus already in 2008. And you can see that video on YouTube. And he shows us how disastrous, which we already know, but perhaps we don't always have sort of the energy or the capacity to take it in. He shows us how disastrous our animal industry really is. And Harari, from a slightly different point of view, from a historian's point of view, actually says the same thing. Animals are the main victims of history, and the treatment of domesticated animals in industrial farms is perhaps the worst crime in history. And of course, this isn't new, but in this case, we can see that for many, many reasons, people actually really point to the fact that we need to think about how we treat animals. Because if we don't, these waves of pandemics and epidemics will just return and return and return. At least that's the way I understand it. It's not the only reason, but it's an important reason. Especially since we started to treat animals in an industrial way. I mean, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, perhaps, they led a relatively happy life on a farm for a number of years before they were slaughtered. But today, they live like in concentration camps. And Martinus also tells us that the karma, come back to cause and effect, that we can receive. For example, in the Second World War, when people experienced concentration camps, could actually be the result of treating animals in a very, very bad way. And it's also interesting to note that I was talking about fear in the beginning, and I'd come back to fear, but it's interesting, I think, to imagine that the fear that people might experience right now might very well be similar to the fear that an animal feels, senses, when being put to death. Yeah, I see that Jonas is nodding to me from the studio, Klint. I mean, it's not it's not as if we can't think of that. I think that small children have a lot of empathy with animals, and it's sort of a cultural tradition that they have learned not to listen to that empathy. And I know that there's no coincidence that so many young people today are turning vegan and want to take care of the planet. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that the coronavirus so far doesn't seem to affect young people to the same extent that it has affected older people. So from one point of view, yes, that is an important connection. And then moving on to Martinus's own text, he points out very, very clearly, and he wrote very early about the importance of food and the dangers of meat eating from several aspects. So he actually pointed out that there is a clear connection between killing animals and the fear that we induce in them. You can see it here, since terrestrial people eat meat and take part in pursuing and destroying the life of more highly developed animals and inevitably bring about fear in animals, how could they themselves live in an atmosphere where there is no fear? So they sow fear, and we must reap what we have sown. Simply, you can read it for yourself. He puts it very, very clearly. And then back to this cosmic connection between whatever we do, whatever we think, all the actions that we have will inevitably return to us. So if we feel fear today, and I mean, Martinus tells us everyone will just act according to his or her own best possibilities. So we shouldn't just tell people or be angry at people for doing what they are doing, but you could consider yourself, if I do feel a lot of fear right now, where could I possibly cause fear in somebody else? Or have I caused fear in animals, or perhaps just by buying food in the supermarket, where you don't really see the connection? So he gives us these lines to think about, I think. The hidden spirit behind the killing trade. It's very aptly put, I think. So this is probably one of the global trends that I think is going to change very quickly. It already started, but I think that the coronavirus will certainly highlight this even more. And moving on to, I think, the third part, the third key point of this talk is, of course, to see this on an even higher level, not just that if we in a concrete way are harming animals, it could harm us, because we shouldn't have that close contact with animals anyway. They are meant to be free outside. We shouldn't keep them inside. They are not born to be our slaves. It's a mistake. Or it's something that we have done, but we must take the consequences. We can't do that in the future. But that goes for everything. So you see this in his symbol number 18, where he describes to us in one of the many examples, one of the many symbols he wrote. He drawed 100 symbols in all, that we have many, many different lives. We see those lives as orange sections here. We see the present life here with our eternal being, and we see that we create with our arcs of fate, as he puts it, consisting of mother energy. Whatever we create will create our future existence. So we want a happy life without fear. Then of course we need to think about our actions and our thoughts. He also says that whatever good we will do will also inevitably turn back to us, which is a good thing, because then you can influence your fate today, even this afternoon, by doing something good, and you know that will come back to you sooner or later. So it's a very optimistic view in that respect. But it could also explain that within this collective karma, because we now see that this virus is being used, Martinus would say, it's being used by providence in order to induce a collective karma wave. But it's not a matter of, it's not random, it's not a matter of this or that when it comes to who will get the virus, who will get ill, who will get very ill. It's always our individual karma. It's always what we need to know. And since I am a teacher, I also very much like the fact that Martinus uses the metaphor of the school of life, that life is a school, Because we know that when we go to school, especially as children, perhaps also students where I'm working, not all the lessons are equally easy or interesting. And we know that the teacher has, hopefully, planned the lessons, has a real plan, not just for one lesson, but for a series of lessons. And we need that if we go through with it, if we try to learn all the things, we will get a result, we have a goal, we will know more when we finish than we did before. Children want to learn how to read and write, even if they struggle on their way. And in the same way, I think that if we see this, it might be some hard lessons that we have to learn in these waves. But if we can trust that there is a good lesson planner, the best lesson planner ever, actually, Providence or God, the Godhead, and that there is love behind all the lessons that we need to learn. We get individual feedback. Karma has sort of a negative tone, perhaps a negative sense, but if you look upon it as feedback and think about it, okay, now I really experienced this unpleasant experience, but I can learn from it. Because if I wouldn't get that experience, how could I ever develop? Because we know that we always want to develop. That's even more important than having fun, I think, that we want to develop. So to have trust in God as the greatest teacher ever, the best teacher, the best lesson planner that we have, that we could imagine, and you could also have a private and intimate conversation with that lesson planner, would make it easier perhaps to see those patterns. Yes, but I think it's also a very, very pedagogical way of showing us that this is a basic principle. It's not created, it's just is. You can't, it's not in that sense good or bad, it's just part of creation. It's part of the perfect balance between light and darkness that he calls love. And you can see the same in the next picture on the next slide, where we have another symbol showing the arcs of fate, namely symbol number 16, the eternal body, where you can also see that we have our eternal body of being here with our eye, and that all the things that we do, he calls it X1, X2, and so on. But all the things that we do, all the thoughts that we send out to someone. If I send out a nice thought to Jonas right now, or to Mary in Copenhagen, or to anyone that I don't like, if I send out a bad thought or a negative thought or a positive thought, it will inevitably come back to me. So we can just trust in that principle. It will always work. It's very, very safe. And it means that we need to realize that there is no use in getting irritated. I think there is an expression in English, don't shoot the postman. I'm not sure. But I mean, why get irritated at the person bringing back the bad karma to you or the unpleasant karma to you? In a sense, I think it's no use being angry with the virus. Perhaps I could talk to you, Mary, about it later, because I think that many people said we should fight the virus. And yes, of course, we should protect our bodies, our health, and our elderly. But to think of the virus as an enemy would be, I think, to diminish the fact that, or just to oversee the fact that we actually caused this ourselves. It's not the virus, these are just living beings doing what they are meant to do. So he says in this quote from the Cosmic Consciousness, everywhere one feels persecuted, feels punished by fate. And here again, you have this martyrdom feeling. No matter whether it shows itself as a direct persecution by one's fellow beings, or it shows itself as illness, sorrow, or poverty. So here we have illnesses. Indeed, no matter the nature of the suffering, from a cosmic point of view, be an absolutely natural manifestation of cause and effect. And it goes on the next slide. Which in turn is a link. And here comes the positive side of it. So we have cause and effect. We did something not very good. We get an unpleasant effect. And then we see the positive side of it. It's the perfection of the great process of creation, during which the earth is transformed from its state of fire to its present state, where animal life can live there, and through which it will be guided towards such a finished state that current sufferings will be a thing of the past. And that's very important as well, that it is a long, long, long journey of development. We remember the spiral cycle. It's a very, very long way from a virus to a human being. But we, in our turn, have a very, very long way to walk, to go, to develop many, many lives before we can turn into real human beings, where we will now have no sufferings any longer. But it is a part of a development process. And if you also have time to walk more in nature right now, which many people have because we work home or we are isolated, we can certainly sense the huge organic process of development taking place in nature. So much life everywhere, so much development, so many interesting details. And why wouldn't that be the case with our development as well? Why would we be separate from nature? We aren't, according to Martinus. That's just sort of a human thought that humans are something else than nature. Right. So that would be sort of the high level where we find hope, support, I think, feel, and we see those big perspectives. And then perhaps we turn off the computer or we stop reading and we listen to the news. And then we notice, at least I do, very often the difference between theory and practice. Right, we know all that, but we live here and now. Today is the 2nd May of 2020. And yes, many of us actually just ask, when will everything get back to normal again? How can I cope with stress, fear, and worry? I mean, the virus looks quite scary, actually. We see those pictures everywhere, like aliens once again. And how long will it take? When will I meet my parents or my grandchildren? And when will we get back to work? Will it ever be normal? Will I ever be able to fly again? Will I die from the coronavirus? It could be so many things that we do fear about. Or that we think about. And to cope with this is, of course, not something where you could just buy a book and learn, but there are books. We have Martinus's own literature. He actually gives us many practical examples, and I think I get a lot of inspiration by reading and discussing his works with others. But as I said in the beginning, in my 4th key point, I also found this quote very, very suitable to this question, namely the fact that we consist of 2 different mental sets, so to speak. You notice from the symbol number 11, the main symbol, that we are in the middle. We are in a transition phase of being animals, which means that we have all the animal instincts in us, all the thought climates. Martinus has drawn them as well. So we have that side. It's working. We have practiced those talents in many lives. We can't just put them aside. Even if we would like to push a button, perhaps. So this is the book that's not yet been translated into English. We hope it will be. It's called in Swedish, Livet en fråga om kärlek, and in English, Life, a question of love. And it's a book written by the psychologist Søren Grind. I think that many of you listening to Swedish or Danish or English lectures know him. And he has written 2 books in Swedish and Danish about cosmic psychology. And then we have this quote. We tend to experience all phobias, conflicts, and problems of relationships more or less as a threat to our existence. And I think that's exactly what we do right now. We experience this coronavirus as a threat. A bigger threat than starvation, for example, even if perhaps more people die from it. It gets dramatic. The body is set into a stage of alarm and fighting, as if life stands or falls by our victory against this inner or outer threat. So again, I think that is, we just move back to this slide. We can see, yes, we have a state of alarm. We want to protect ourselves. We get irritated, perhaps angry at our neighbors, at other countries. I won't go much into nationalism, but we can, of course, see the tendencies of nations closing together, closing their borders, being stronger than ever, perhaps. And it goes on for most people, our intelligence is not yet strong enough to consciously stop the fears that those instinctive systems of survival activate in our body. Consequently, in different areas, our thinking may be kidnapped by our fears. So we have again, yes, we think, we have an intellectual capacity. This capacity could actually be used perhaps to induce more fear, because we could imagine all the bad things that could happen to us. And then we get even more nervous. And it's not strong enough. Our capacity to love and the balance between intelligence and feeling is not yet strong enough to think logically. But we have the time to practice, so it's not a problem. But it's good to realize perhaps now our thinking has been kidnapped, or perhaps I could say hijacked in English, by our fears. And that is something that we should be generous talking about. That we shouldn't just think that that's necessarily a bad thing. We know we have these animal instincts, and we also know, and it says in the book as well, that our primary instinct as animals is the fear of death. So this is probably what this coronavirus pandemic triggers, the fear of death. It could be your own death, it could be death of your family. I myself was very, very nervous because my 2 sons were abroad when this happened and borders closed. I perhaps wasn't nervous that it would get the virus, but I sort of was terrified that it wouldn't get home. So I could feel it triggered something, which could be remembrances of past life or anything, but it triggered something. So, I mean, in the animal kingdoms, people kill each other and we have to protect ourselves. So we enjoyed war and violence and so on earlier on. Most of us don't do that any longer. So we just need to realize that this is part of it. And again, if we remember what Martinus tells us, okay, if I experience fear, is it because I do induce fear in other beings? How do I treat people? How do I treat animals? How do I treat my body, the microcosmic beings in my body? Because if you do experience fear, it's not perhaps the best environment to them either. So just to realize this is one step forward. And that, realizing that, just thinking about it, practicing this, we have lots of time to practice like we have in school. We have many, many lessons. I think I will come to an end in this presentation, and that is the title of the lecture or this talk, To Find Hope and Meaning in Challenging Times or in the Darkness. And I haven't really talked a lot about God. Perhaps I will when I get connected to Mary, because it's difficult to talk about Martinus analysis without talking about God, about his definition of God being the driving force, being the entire universe. So you can talk to God. Many people think of God as being something connected to our old religions and being perhaps a strange concept that you can't relate to. So that's very, very individual. But also it says that many people in Sweden believe in something they call something. So if you don't want to call it God, you could just call it something and talk to something. And just feel that, share your thoughts with something. Could be nature. Just try to share your thoughts and see if you can find meaning and hope doing that. Martinus tells us that we could practice prayer. He tells us it's very, very important that we can't, he doesn't understand that we dare to live without praying, I think. And he, even if he had cosmic consciousness, as he tells us in his books, he constantly prayed in the sense that he was constantly in contact with the Godhead, asking what was the right thing to do, the right thing to say, and so on. So when we learn to do that, when we realize that we have made all those mistakes, he tells us that we are rooted in God. And I feel that even if we don't always feel connected, it's like not being connected to a Wi-Fi. We know that the Wi-Fi is there, but we sometimes be connected, sometimes we're not. And that is mainly because of us. But if we can keep the feeling, just imagine, start theoretically imagining that it could be that we are rooted in something bigger, and that there is a good meaning to this, and that there is hope, and that we could find hope by just reading more about it and talk about it. Well, you could just try it out and see what happens. And I know that many of you do, because if you're interested in this, you're already exploring this. And reading spiritual literature, for example, Martinus's works, Could also be anything else that interests you, that gives you nourishment. Because if you do that, I wrote that later on, if you do things that promote not your animal sides of anger and fear and self-preservation, if you want to promote your humane sides, our humane thought climates, then you will feel better. At least you could try it out, but I think that most of us will feel better. I notice that I feel better when I listen to music, for example. You could read, you could practice art, creative things, literature, any of those things that belong to our real humane, positive side. So things, peace, all the things that we're longing for, where we actually know that even dying is perhaps not the worst thing that could happen. It doesn't mean that we want to die, but we could just see the perspectives. Martinus tells us we have many lives. Perhaps we need to endure an illness or even death. We will die sometime or other. So it's just a question of when. But it's not the worst thing that could happen. So try to practice those thoughts. We have lots of time to practice. You could find sanctuary in nature. I think many people do. And again, I'm privileged to be living in Scandinavia. But I think that many people are right now experiencing nature in a closer way than before. And this crisis tells us too, I think, that we really need to preserve nature. We have learned that from the younger generation following Greta Thunberg, that it's very, very important to take care of the earth as well. We could also, I think, limit the impact of negative news, since we know that it gives us a lot of stress and feeling of not being in control. So you could keep informed, but you don't need to exaggerate, perhaps. That is just one way of finding hope and balance. And most importantly, probably try to stay connected. If you think it's impossible to think and try to be connected with God, we can be connected to our friends. We talk a lot about social distancing. I think we should call it physical distancing, because I think thanks to technology today, people seem to be more connected than ever. All those 1.5 billion children and students, they are connected to their teachers, socially connected. So we're not disconnected, and we should take care of all our friends and get nourishment from our friends, and also, of course, take care of your microcosmos, which I think I might talk more about with Mary after the break. These are just a few things that I know that friends of mine have brought up in earlier live streamings, and you might have other tips that you would like to share. And I would like to end by just giving a few more words from our master, if you could call him that. And it is about connection, being connected. Because we realize now, I think, even if our physical parts, which could actually be perhaps our animal parts, are restricted, we don't have the physical freedom perhaps that we like, that we are used to. But mentally, we are even closer than ever. I mean, I feel quite close to Klint, even if I'm not there and I don't know when I can come back. But I think I've been talking to people in Klint many times, for example, to Jonas in the studio. And I think we are connected. I'm very, very happy to be connected to you who might be listening right now or listening later on, and to share your thoughts and views on this, even if you can't meet. I think it gets more important than ever to be connected in that sense. So then again, to conclude, we could see that we are connected. And I think this is a process of being aware of it, getting more aware of it than before. He says, looking at the quote, and this is from the first volume of the Book of Life, Livets Bow, his main work. Seen from a cosmic point of view, terrestrial mankind collectively consists of one assembled body in which each single individual makes up one unit, so all of us. The single individual's manifestation, therefore, cannot release itself in any other way whatsoever than by being identical with a participating factor in the fate formation of the whole of mankind. And that means that you and I and everyone else, we are actually very, very important. Nobody is more important than anyone else. Everyone is important. We are connected, and we all participate in the fate formation of the whole of mankind. And I think this corona crisis, this pandemic, could be one really, really important event, important process where we could actually contribute to a better fate than we have before the pandemic. Right. I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you will be back. We'll have 10 minutes break, and then I hope I will be back with Mary. So bye for Stockholm.